In the era Kingdom Hearts was made, it's easy to imagine Square getting the rights to make a Final Fantasy Disney crossover and quickly churning out some rushed title. You could see them plucking the turn-based combat system from one of their most recent Final Fantasy titles, slapping in some Disney character models and backgrounds, and not taking too many risks. So the fact that they instead decided to take this collaboration as an opportunity to create their first major real-time combat 3D action adventure game, and for the time, probably one of the most cutting-edge ones in the medium, is still one of the most impressive things about 2002's Kingdom Hearts. Final Fantasy's turn-based mechanics are translated into a fully real-time action game very literally, for lack of a better word. One could be tempted to call it lazy if it didn't work out so well. The game basically straps a turn-based combat menu onto a freely controllable character and calls it a day. You move your character with the left stick and can cycle through the menu with the right stick or D-pad to pick between attacks, magic, or items. The right stick feels like the way to go, since cycling this way allows you to move your character and navigate the menu at once comfortably. This means rotating the camera is relegated to L2 and R2, which will move it left and right respectively. In an action title, rotating the camera with two buttons isn't the quickest or smoothest way to get a beat on a target, but between the camera lock-on function on R1, the ability to cycle said lock's focus between different foes, and a command to snap the camera quickly behind you, there's enough to work with so as to usually be able to see what you're doing in combat. More importantly, you can perform all these camera movements while still being able to move and select moves at the same time, since your thumbs can remain on those analog sticks while your index fingers readjust the view. You could argue seeing what you want in combat can require a little too much extra effort here sometimes, but the tools to do so are there, and it works. X selects whatever is currently highlighted in the menu, but so does clicking the right stick, which means if you navigate the menu with the right stick, you can select a command without moving your thumb back to X to confirm the selection, offering you a split-second advantage, which in the world of real-time action can be the difference between life and death. So while a very blunt translation of Final Fantasy mechanics into real-time action, it works surprisingly well. I guess the question becomes though, was there a better way to do it? Well, the game also includes a shortcut system. While holding L1, 3 of the face buttons become shortcuts to activate 3 abilities of your choosing without moving through the menu. Any ability in this quick select list becomes far quicker to activate than anything in your main command menu, which requires a little more effort to navigate. There's no getting around the fact that as you play, outside of your basic attack, the 3 abilities in this quick select become the ones you'll most rely on. By comparison, anything in your command menu will start to feel like something you have to dig for relative to what's in your little shortcut menu. You might start to build up a grudge towards the command menu purely because your brain desires nothing more than to be able to get to anything in that menu as fast as the 3 things you're allowed to have access to almost instantly. While I could probably sit here and workshop a control scheme that combines the efficiency of the quick select with the breadth of options in the command menu, I think it's worth pointing out that in the grand scheme of things, Kingdom Hearts is still quite commendable for offering any kind of breadth in this department at all. It's not hard to imagine another version of Kingdom Hearts where the only extra abilities you have access to in combat are the few you have in a shortcut menu, with anything else requiring you to pause the game to switch out to. Instead, we get an action title where pretty much any combat ability your character has is accessible in the heat of said action, which is a big deal implementation aside. Again, not to say the implementation lacks merit. There is a unique kind of satisfaction derived from quickly navigating this menu in the heat of the moment. Your movements on the right analog stick almost acting as these kind of fighting game inputs as you quickly pull it towards your command of choice. If we choose to rate the combat system and how it controls on a scale of efficiency, uniqueness, or how satisfying it is to use, I'd say it ranks fairly highly on all three of those meters. Maybe it doesn't max out any one of those scales, but overall I'd say it's a success, especially worthy of praise, considering it's the first outing for this take on real-time combat from Square. Uniqueness in and of itself may not sound like a virtue, but when it comes to real-time action, Kingdom Hearts tests you in a way with its menu system that other action games simply don't. And I think the way this command menu system, the language of the mechanics in Kingdom Hearts, comes together and melds with the context and even themes of the story is really cool. The change in combat language from the abstract perspective of turn-based combat to the relatively speaking more literal view of events real-time combat offers, I think makes it appropriate that Kingdom Hearts opts for a protagonist like Sora, who's much more of an audience surrogate than the Final Fantasy protagonists that came before. All video games feature abstraction to one degree or another, but it's fair to say real-time combat comes closer to emulating how we perceive events in reality compared to turn-based combat. If real-time gameplay moves us closer to emulating reality, appropriately the game sets the stage with you playing in something closer to the real world. Rather than starting in a fantasy world as some complex fantasy character, Sora and friends are just normal kids, granted with eccentric fashion taste, who dream of adventure from what is essentially their playground.
Say, Kyrie, what was your hometown like? You know, where you grew up?
I've told you before. I don't remember, but I wouldn't mind going to see it.
I'd like to see it too. Along with any other worlds out there. I want to see them all.
So what are we waiting for?
Hey! Aren't you guys forgetting about me?
As someone who lives in the real world themselves, and who as a once young video game playing kid in 2002 may have also allegedly cast themselves as the hero in the odd playground adventure, bluntly getting thrown the Final Fantasy command menu in real time in Kingdom Hearts was about as relatively close as Square could get back in the day to giving me the powers of an FF character. This parallels Sora, whose wooden sword play fights become the real deal when he's sucked into a world of real adventure, and is forced to get to grips with Final Fantasy powers and abilities himself. While this new perspective on FF combat is a novelty for Kingdom Hearts, another huge novelty is getting to walk within the worlds of the Disney movies. This is where the game manages to really thrive as a crossover. It uses past media to build its universe, but doesn't feel stale since both sides get a fresh spin. Real-time combat for Final Fantasy, and a new level of interactivity for Disney. Disney have already shown an interest in providing a more immersive take on their films through the medium of theme parks, making a video game like KH the perfect fit to work with that concept further. Each level has a theme park feel to it, from the classic characters roaming about you can interact with, to the themed ride-like minigames you can find throughout them. More importantly, the comparison is driven home for me by how each level has a distinct, unique gimmick that tries to draw on the theme of the movie the stage is based on to attract and keep your interest. You can become a gladiator in Olympus Coliseum, swim in Atlantica, fly in Neverland, or get really lost in Monstro. Taking a movie and theme parkifying them into a video game for your young kid protagonist to go explore is a no-brainer. But how do you do the same for other pre-existing video games like Final Fantasy that were conceived to be interactive and immersive to begin with? All levels from previous media and KH are that of Disney properties, which makes a lot of sense. Square probably thought it would be redundant to include Final Fantasy game locations like Midgar or Balam Garden when you can already explore those places comprehensively in the FF games. Instead, Final Fantasy gets theme parkified, which yes, I am gonna say twice, mechanically. The command menu gets handed to a kid to play around with in real time like a toy. While in Final Fantasy it feels more like you're telling a character to use thunder, here in real time, in a relative sense, it feels much more like you're getting to try it for a change. Of course, even if specific Final Fantasy worlds don't appear, Final Fantasy-esque locations and characters do. Sora here is of course the key to all this. An original character whose design pulls from both Disney and Final Fantasy, and therefore can interact with the cast of these disparate IPs with relative ease without it looking or feeling too jarring. While the way his background contrasts with that of the Final Fantasy protagonists makes him a good fit for being the player avatar as we shift the perspective of the gameplay to this real-time style, his demeanor, his bright-eyed, enthusiastic attitude is also a perfect fit for the stages here. You could see the character wanting to interact with all the characters, attractions, rides, and sights these theme park type levels have to offer. Even more importantly though, Sora's real-world origins yet fairly blank slate background lend themselves well to giving the interactions of this game with such a diverse range of characters a personal touch. It does feel a little more like it's the player getting to meet the Disney cast and characters here. Imagine for a second that instead, this game had starred a pre-established character like Mickey Mouse or Cloud Strife. I feel like it would have been harder to get invested. It would have just been more legends interacting with other legends, rather than you, the player, getting to interact with legends and maybe in the process become a fresh new legend yourself. Not every game needs an audience surrogate protagonist, of course, but in a game where the core premise is that you play the interloper in a series of already famous stories, I think it's the best fit. Sora is a clean palette, someone from a non-fantasy world who can bring out the flavor of these famous fantasy characters even more than if, say, someone with another fantastical background was to be our avatar on this adventure. Also imagine if the entire game had just been a retelling of some pre-existing character's story. Here, even if you've seen all the Disney movies and played all the Final Fantasies, thanks to the original cast, you still don't know where the story's gonna go. Intimate and personal aren't terms you'd expect to use to describe a project that brings so many brands and recognizable larger-than-life characters together to share the stage. What could easily have felt like a navel-gazing exercise in self-aggrandizement for these brands instead feels like the opposite. Like these legends are here to complement and bolster a new story, a new legend in the making. Your legend even, thanks again to how great of an audience surrogate Sora is. Combat remains exciting thanks to some smart design decisions. Sora and your party members can only equip a limited amount of recovery items when entering a fight. So you can't drip feed to yourself your entire supply of collected health items or magic recovery items to get through a tricky encounter. This incentivizes getting proactive in fights to recover health or magic, whether it be to conserve your item supply or because you're out of items altogether. Defeated enemies can drop health and magic recovery orbs, but even better, simply hitting a foe enough times will start refilling your magic meter. Magic is very important to recover, since even if you're not too reliant on magic attacks, magic meter is needed to cast healing magic and defensive magic, as well as the offensive magic moves. This rewards taking risks. Encouraging a player to head back into a fight to replenish resources is of course a great way to create tense situations. It might sound like this kind of system is par for the course for an action game, so I think it's important for me to contextualize just how crucial having just a tiny sliver of magic can be here. One unit of magic alone can easily be the difference between living or dying in Kingdom Hearts. Sora can be taken out pretty quickly, and one segment of magic can be enough to go from the next hit ending your game to the entire fight being back in your favor. Leaping back into the fray to recover just a single magic segment can be pretty tense and exciting, especially in boss fights. Party members are another factor. You can stock them up with items, and throughout the game they learn various abilities that will come in handy for healing or dealing damage to enemies. Out of battle, you can also suggest what they should focus on in battle. Even with this suggestion system in place, it can still feel at times like it's a roll of the dice whether a party member will come in to save the day with a heal, or whether you'll end up chewing dirt while they remain occupied elsewhere. You could imagine some kind of in-depth system for commanding partners mid-battle, maybe something like the L1 quick select but for issuing commands. The only significant control you have over party members mid-fight is which enemy they should focus on attacking via the lock-on system. Now, we could sit here and imagine a version of Kingdom Hearts where you have more control over your teammates in battle. Maybe even an extra tab in the command menu to give direct orders with, such as telling a teammate to heal you or cast a shield over the party. But let us also consider how this would actually play out. In turn-based combat, telling an ally to use an item or heal the team is a big decision. If you do, they can't do anything else except that until their turn comes back around again, which is a considerable amount of time. It might even be after everyone else on the battlefield, friend or foe, has also made a move. Meanwhile, in real-time battles like the ones in KH, commanding a partner to heal you in real time probably wouldn't have much of a downside. It wouldn't be that different from just healing yourself. Your teammate would stop what they're doing for at most a second or two to send a heal your way, and then they'd go straight back to attacking or whatever they were doing. There wouldn't be much to think about if you had more direct control. A party command tab on your command menu would essentially turn into a second item inventory to use in battle. As it stands, the teammate system gives you enough control to make it a factor to consider, gives your various story friends some role within gameplay, and while you may feel at times that a certain attempt at a boss could have been saved by a teammate reacting as fast as they might have done in the past, ultimately nothing is going to win the fight more than playing well enough to where relying on teammates for healing doesn't even become a factor. And in my experience, on the whole, setting your teammates to focus on support usually results in them being pretty on the ball, with a few exceptions here and there. The way KH goes about creating the 3D environments based on the Disney properties is as ambitious as its stab at real-time Final Fantasy combat, but also where the title's ambitions perhaps start to get the better of it. If I had to point to the biggest issue with Kingdom Hearts, it's how the world design and its gimmicks, while impressive in their variety, often don't stick the landing, and start to distract in a bad way from the core systems that are already plenty complex and compelling. Platforming is abundant and sometimes fairly demanding for a game where you can't manually angle the camera up or down. Atlantica adds some rigid verticality control with its swimming mechanics that restrict you from using a lot of abilities, such as blocking, which is kind of a big one. Once you unlock the swimming dash that requires a double tap of the buttons that control your vertical movement, it's easy to go into a dash by accident when you wanted to quickly change direction between up and down. Dashes here can be easily cancelled, but it's a correction you won't want to think about having to make when in the middle of a hectic fight. This results in one of the game's most frustrating bosses, the giant Ursula fight, where your limited moveset, the awkward swimming controls, as well as the boss's stage sweeping moves, combine to put your patience to the test. In my expert difficulty playthrough for this game, this was the only time I dipped to do another part of the story first instead, so I could amass further stats and skills for a greater advantage. This isn't to say that Ursula is the only or hardest boss, but it is the only boss that feels sloppy enough in design that really sitting down to learn its ins and outs and come out on top just isn't terribly appealing like it is with other much more enjoyable challenging encounters. In total fairness, it is a skippable fight, so there is that. Some levels also expect a questionable amount of intuition from the player to figure out what to do next. I'm thinking returning to the shop after exploring in the first Traverse Town visit, or clearing out Deep Jungle's enemies for the gorillas. It goes without saying also that while it's intended to be a maze, navigating the repetitive Monstro level is hardly what I'd describe as an enjoyable challenge. In most stages, though, the visuals are very high quality. Crisp and clear, they serve the combat, and have a high level of detail, though this is what likely costs the game in terms of performance, as well as forcing the title's environments to be divided between short but consistent loading times. I would have liked to see far more seamless environments, even if it had meant dialing back on the visuals to get there perhaps. Once gliding is introduced, it's very stop and start, flying around into black loading gates. Not all worlds here are created equal. Halloween Town, Agrabah, and especially Deep Jungle are large enough in scope to feel like convincing translations of the movies, while Neverland, Olympus, and Monstro are far more limited in their scope. Wonderland takes the curious, creative visual decision to be completely subterranean, putting ceilings even on ostensibly outdoor environments. This translation depicts Wonderland as much more literally taking place underground inside the rabbit hole through which you descend into it. It's an interesting take, but I think it just ends up making the level feel unnecessarily claustrophobic. Inside this boxy Wonderland, it's hard to feel much wonder. It's surprising that with all these disparate environments, the game manages to come together as a cohesive whole, and I think it does because of how it mashes all these different movies and games together without a hint of irony. It's just so confident and lacking in cynicism about its premise. But it's not just confidence that makes this marriage work. The disparity in design between the different worlds and their characters also lends itself well to the story they're trying to tell about Sora, who, after his world gets absorbed into darkness, must go on a quest to find his friends Riku and Kairi, while saving other worlds from the same fate as his. Sora's most endearing trait is how open he is to befriending others, and this couldn't be any more evident than in a game which features such wildly different characters in terms of both design and theme. It doesn't matter who they are, animal person, fish person, or walking corpse. Sora is happy to get to know them and lend a helping hand. The fact that he's able to do that in any environment, no matter what tropes that environment is displaying, is one of the most charming aspects of Kingdom Hearts. This isn't to say Sora is nice to a fault. He is reserved around those he feels may not be worthy of his good nature, but this caution doesn't present itself for superficial reasons. While Sora interacts with the world and their denizens with an almost childlike approach, curious and excited to get to know new pals and places, his childhood friend and rival Riku takes the adult approach to making his way through the universe. Favors for favors, palling around with unsavory characters for personal gain, and generally approaching the world around him with a bitter cynicism masked as maturity. This leads him to being taken advantage of, eventually to the point where his own body doesn't even belong to him anymore, his actions eventually being completely under the control of others. If you choose to inhabit a sphere where everyone just cares about personal gain, nobody has really got your back. Calling Riku Sora's friend/rival isn't the full story though. If anything, starting Kingdom Hearts feels like you just started playing as the comedy sidekick of the real hero. Riku is self-assured, strong, cheeky, ambitious, and ready for action, a more typical hero figure. With Donald and Goofy, the comedy sidekick counterparts to Mickey Mouse, being your teammates in this game, it feels like you're essentially playing as the comedy sidekick crew. But while doing so, you perhaps prove that they have something the characters who fit the more traditional hero archetype in this game don't. Once again, I think this feeds into the audience surrogate nature of Sora's character. If you were playing Square games at the time, you were likely a dorky kid, at least relative to the kind of protagonist Final Fantasy titles had. If you're going to enter a world with the language of Final Fantasy and get the powers and abilities that come with that, but now, quote-unquote, for real, with a single POV and with that real-time gameplay context, you're gonna have to do it as a dorky kid here. I like how the game reinforces how much stronger Riku is than you by letting you spar with him for fun at the start and making it a brutal fight.
You still don't got it.
You can come out on top, but even then the game keeps track of your score, reminding you of your losses and undermining the win. On your first playthrough, it's unlikely you're gonna beat him first time round. Sora's weapon in this game, the powerful, mystical Keyblade, chooses who wields it, and at the start of the game, it seems set to pick Riku as its wielder. He's the man after all. That's right up until the moment Riku takes his ambition to the extreme and accepts some seriously dodgy powers, at which point the Keyblade repulsed seemingly chooses to be wielded by the closest other person around at the time, which in this case is Sora. A moment of confusion on the Keyblade's part, perhaps. Sora's way of going about things, befriending others and helping people out with no reward in mind, is vindicated throughout the whole game, as he makes friends and saves the world with them, becoming stronger and stronger while doing so. But it's fully vindicated near the end of the game. The Keyblade, over its confusion, returns to Riku.
Let the Keyblade choose. Its true master.
Donald and Goofy are tasked by Mickey at the start of the game to follow whoever wields the Keyblade, and so they too leave Sora to follow Riku. What follows is one of the coolest sequences in the game.
Go play hero with this.
Sora keeps fighting through this near endgame level regardless, whether it's with the powerful Keyblade or the stick he played with at the start of the game. Ultimately, the bond Sora has formed with Donald and Goofy is strong enough that the two forsake their objective to be by their friend's side, demonstrating that alliances of convenience have nothing on a real bond. In this moment, it's no surprise that the Keyblade changes its mind and goes from Riku back to Sora. It realizes who truly is the powerful one between them. In the Kingdom of Hearts, Sora is king. Kingdom Hearts has amazing sequences throughout its story that are executed superbly. Gameplay, theme, and narrative all come together to create powerful moments. Where Kingdom Hearts perhaps undermines itself is with how it approaches world building and explaining how said world works. The science of Kingdom Hearts, so to speak, can be very confusing, and that's because it takes a lot of immaterial concepts like heart and the light and darkness of the soul, and then turns them into physical concepts that exist within the universe. So heart can power machines and gateways, and in general, influence the world in a literal way. Inner darkness can manifest as real power that's used to teleport or create weapons. The issue is that when characters talk about heart, darkness, and all the rest, it can sometimes be hard to parse whether or not they're referring to the intangible, merely conceptual definition of these terms, or their physical, magical manifestations that characters can wield for various purposes. Of course, this is the point of Kingdom Hearts, to take emotion and feeling and explore them by converting them into tangible things within this game's universe. But that cool idea can't help but turn a lot of cutscenes into word soup, where you can't really tell if characters are talking figuratively or literally. Interpreting these scenes can be part of the fun, but I think you could argue the cryptic nature of some of the exchanges here can end up obfuscating the impact of some of the title's greater dramatic sequences.
The darkness may destroy my body, but it can't touch my heart.
If you end up lost in the language of it all rather than enjoying the emotion of the moment. Most of the world building is delivered by Final Fantasy characters, who as the representatives of games with complex 50-hour plotlines, seem suited to this role. While they bring over their look, and in the case of Cloud, some similar relationships, for the most part their backgrounds and personalities don't reflect those they had in the Final Fantasy games. Aerith and Yuffie especially so, since outside of their new KH backstories, they also seem to have ingested an almost lethal amount of Xanax. Cloud seems the most like himself, and even brings over his relationship with Aerith to give him something in common with his FF7 incarnation. In a sense, on the whole though, the FF cast aren't really the same characters as their original incarnations from the Final Fantasy games, as opposed to most of the Disney cast featured, whose personalities and backgrounds are pretty close to the media they originate from. However, the Final Fantasy cast do bring an aesthetic, an energy, a mood that's very Final Fantasy to the game, even if they don't resemble their original game counterparts that much. It's interesting how few Final Fantasy characters are in the game when you consider that not having to make their respective world or justify their original backstory within Kingdom Hearts would have made it pretty easy to include them all over the place here. Their presence doesn't feel fully fleshed out, they're basically skins for original characters to wear, but this isn't a huge deal. As I've talked about extensively, the crossover that's happening here isn't some basic one where it's just some characters from two companies meeting. It's very specifically a crossover between mediums. It's between the characters and worlds of a series of movies, with the mechanical gameplay language and aesthetic style of a series of games. This isn't about Cloud meeting Aladdin and what kind of banter they'd have. They meet in the middle for an experience unlike either side of the crossover have delivered before. Whether these FF guys were here or not, this would still be a crossover between FF and Disney. So what's really cool is getting to see certain Disney characters exist outside of the framework of their movies, seeing how their abilities translate from said films into the realm of an action game with universe-ending stakes. The Beast from Beauty and the Beast is probably one of the coolest examples of this experiment. It's established that traveling between worlds in Kingdom Hearts is extremely difficult, and only something a very select few can learn how to do. That said, when Belle from Beauty and the Beast is kidnapped by the game's villains, the Beast is able, through sheer force of will, to open up a tear in space-time and jump through to her location.
He apparently followed her here through sheer force of will.
It's badass, but also pretty crazy. What makes it work is that, hey, the Beast is a magical creature whose capabilities aren't fully known. They can't be explored within the context of the 90-minute movie he's from. Maybe if this scenario had presented itself in his film, he would have been able to pull this move off. The opportunity just never arose. But in an action video game with world-ending stakes, Beast shows up to look for Belle during the sequence where Sora has lost the Keyblade to Riku, which is extremely appropriate. For one, because Beast just achieved an extreme feat of will, which Sora also has to accomplish in this segment, but also because at this point they're both outcast, shunned characters working here together for similar goals.
And though I am on my own, I will fight. I won't leave without her. That's why I'm here.
Kingdom Hearts has a few mini-arcs like this that flesh out the characters nicely throughout its rather episodic level-to-level pacing. In fact, it would have been nice to see even more of them. Like how Riku and Sora contrast their methods of helping their friend Kairi in Monstro. Their desire as kids to face monsters together and go on adventures is fulfilled, but in a twisted way as they fight through here barely on the same page, growing distant. Or episodes like the one where Donald and Sora have a falling out during Deep Jungle, and have to get their act together. This Tarzan level really has it all. It's one of the first things that comes to mind when I think of this game. Outside of this little story arc, it has minigames, scale, unique objects to interact with, varied scenery, and of course a boss with a shotgun riding a giant chameleon. I think it's one of the best translations of a film into video game level the title has. It can be hard to give an overall assessment of the bosses in this game because there's such a high amount of them. While some may rub you the wrong way with the odd questionably executed gimmick section, there's always plenty more around the corner to never make it feel like one type of boss or specific gimmick has been overused. The larger bosses are a favorite of mine in this game since it can be quite satisfying to find a way on top for a superior vantage point on their weakness. Fights with humanoid bosses really let the game's block and counter moves shine. The block, I'd say, takes longer to deploy relative to most action titles, but to compensate, the window of time it repels damage for is also longer. This gives the guard its own satisfying taste, the slow wind-up and long effect time appropriately giving it an almost turn-based feel here. Praise should be given to the original enemy designs, the Heartless. Obviously, their strength lies in their versatility. Basic black blobs give way to a diverse range of foes with designs appropriate for each very different looking world. Goofy, round and silly in the locations with a more lighthearted tone, while later, in the darker endgame stages, they become sharper and less cutesy. The sheer number of enemy types make for plenty of unique encounters. Tanks with specific weak points, magic casters and healers, both a large variety of ground and flying types. The game encourages exploiting weak points not just for its own sake, but to accrue bonus XP, the cherry on top of a satisfying play. Deflecting blows with the Keyblade also rewards bonus XP, which if you're really new to this is used to make Sora stronger and unlock new abilities. I doubt the average player will be incentivized enough by this to start going in for all kinds of risky deflections, but if you're an experienced player willing to try those tricky plays for some extra thrill, once again you're rewarded for it, which I think is excellent. Replaying KH with a bit more confidence, for example, yielding faster access to upgrades and new attacks, is only a good thing. It's a testament to the quality of the combat that it can sustain a level that's just a Horde arena mode, and in fact provide some of the title's greatest thrills there. Kingdom Hearts has quite a lot of optional content to take part in on top of its 30-hour or so main story, and the combat being where I think this game's strengths obviously lie, I wish more of this extra content was dedicated to that. There's about 4 major extracurriculars in the game: Winnie the Pooh's minigames, the gummy ship, crafting, and Olympus Coliseum / the extra bosses. There's not much to say about Winnie the Pooh's level. While it's an inspired choice to cast Sora in the role of Christopher Robin, the minigame gameplay here is pretty shallow, slow, and ponderous, and the story content very basic. This segment seems like it was made for very young players who might pick up the game, so it's good for everybody. It's essentially optional. Between main stages, you'll be flying a little ship for a very basic Star Fox-esque level. You can tweak and build this ship both functionally and cosmetically in a very in-depth customization menu. These segments seem to be kind of at odds with themselves. On the one hand, they're really easy so as to not intrude too much on the core gameplay. On the other hand, this makes the insane amount of customization that's possible for the ship seem totally superfluous. Pretty early on in the game, the title lets you warp to levels you've already visited, reducing the need to really think about it even more. While it's a novelty to make some totally bonkers ship, the actual flying just feels too shallow to justify itself. Though for as unintrusive as it ends up being, I'm sure somebody out there got a load of fun out of making tens of different ships and testing them out. So good for them. The Lego-esque nature of this side activity lends itself well, at least, to the playful tone the mid-game takes on. Then we have crafting, or synthesis rather. KH has a forge where materials found throughout the game can be combined into valuable items such as weapons, status recovery consumables, and upgrade points. Even when playing on Expert though, this wasn't a place I visited much during the main story. The requirements for crafting anything are quite steep. While I'd check in at the synthesis forge when I happened to pass through Travis Town to see if I happened to meet said requirements for something at that time, I didn't go out of my way to. Despite being on the harder difficulty, I find that I can comfortably make it to the end game without ever going out of my way to find the ingredients for anything. This system is another nod to previous systems like it in Final Fantasy games, but the way it's implemented here isn't super conducive to any real fun or interesting gameplay. If you want to proactively synthesize something, you'll have to farm a lot of different items by finding and killing specific enemies that carry them over and over again to trigger randomized drops. As you go through the game, you can unlock abilities that make these drops more likely, but the process always feels like a slog. The main reason you might eventually turn your attention towards synthesis is because it's the only way to unlock the Ultima, the most powerful Keyblade. Unlocking this will require the most tedious amount of farming of all. Even in the Western version of PS2 KH, with its 3 extra bosses, just how long it takes to get Ultima still seems unreasonably long given the amount of content that's in the actual game it could be considered worth using on. You might see this as the action gamer in me shining through in opposition to the RPG gamer in me. Honestly though, I feel like the most powerful weapon in the game should be unlocked by coming out on top in some difficult challenge, battle, or series of battles that really put your skills with the core mechanics to the test, rather than it being a reward for having the patience to do something boring. My favorite extra content is of course Olympus Coliseum and the additional boss fights. In the Colosseum, you get to make the most of the combat by fighting your way through hordes of enemies, with bosses mixed into the ranks for good measure. Getting to put your sword skills to the test against Cloud and Squall is a treat, and the game is savvy enough to know that if we face them individually, we're of course going to want to have a stab at it with them together. At a glance, the design of the sword-wielding bosses here may seem simple, but they're very satisfying to take on. It's fairly easy to evade their attacks, but when they hit hard, which when you first start playing can make bosses like these feel very intimidating. Keeping your distance, taking your time, and playing it safe can feel like the best choice. Overcoming that fear, though, is extremely gratifying. Heading in and rattling off a series of deflections to increase the speed of your damage output via successful counters feels great, especially when you know you'll be absorbing a lot of punishment if you mess up. Once again, it's curious to me how few older Final Fantasy characters feature in this game, when the thrill of getting to fight a real-time, high production value approximation of their turn-based moveset is such an enticing prospect. Thankfully, Kingdom Hearts manages to deliver on giving us a fight with probably the FF character you'd most want to throw down with within the systems of KH. Sephiroth pushes the swordplay of this game to its limit, from his basic swipes that hit like a truck to what feels like a limitless escalation of special attacks. An attack that empties your entire health bar unless he's hit also makes for a frantic encounter where remaining in the fight consistently and being proactive is the only way to survive. Sulking off and playing it safe with heals the whole battle isn't an option. Optional bosses like this one round out the game nicely. Sephiroth pushes the sword combat one last time. This Reaper dude at the clock tower forces you to make smart use of your magic. The Aladdin mech makes item use and even smart summoning a focus as it cuts off your supply to magic and physical attacks at different points in the fight. And Ice Titan has you dodging and blocking a lot for one last test of your evasive skills. This last one is probably the lesser optional encounter of the four. You'll be running around in circles a lot to dodge projectiles and waiting for specific attacks that you can counter back at him. But again, it's nice to see all facets of the combat pushed one last time throughout these different optional encounters. It's worth pointing out, if you haven't fully clued into it yet, that this review is based on the NTSC PS2 version of Kingdom Hearts, the earliest version of the game localized into English. In the true first release of the game, the initial Japanese release, Clock Tower Reaper is present, but Sephiroth, Kurt Zizza, and Ice Titan aren't. Which is a shame, because even if the reward for beating those 3 additional NTSC bosses is only XP in the PS2 original, these extra fights really round out the game, I think. I'd say the extra content in terms of offering real post-game challenge would feel pretty naked without them. The Sephiroth fight is one of my favorite moments of the game. Getting to see Sephiroth and the entire breadth of his abilities framed in real time with this level of production value is awesome. The fight exudes style, and considering how quickly Sora can be taken out, is always satisfying to beat. Any combo you manage to land on this smug powerhouse is one of the most satisfying ones you'll do in the game. And of course, a boss fight that plays the sinister yet triumphant one-winged angel is also obviously gonna feel extremely badass. The music of Kingdom Hearts is another element that goes a long way in making the experience feel as high quality as it does. The second you boot it up, you're hit with a wave of melancholy, setting the mood for a story of ups, but also many downs, growing pains. Between its bittersweet music and shots of characters looking off into the horizon, Kingdom Hearts acknowledges, I think, that to go somewhere new, you always have to leave somewhere else behind. If melancholy wasn't enough, organs and dark choirs give shape to the chaotic energy of the title's villains, who have forsaken anything positive in their souls to feel melancholic about. Emotion and drama aren't all the music is good for. Some of the level's themes intended to create ambience are amazing too. Traverse Town's theme envelops you like a warm blanket over a weary traveler. Hollow Bastion's theme feels eerie and desolate, but no less enamored with the majesty of the location. enigmatic and abstract yet energetic opening video depicting a childhood slipping away into an uncertain adulthood, combined with the English rendition of Hikari, Simple and Clean, which itself evokes a kind of mysterious, almost ominous uncertainty about the future, makes for a massive thunderclap to grab your attention the moment you start a new game. Kingdom Hearts starts, spins you around with this opening movie, and throws you into a hellish, nightmarish dark void. That nightmare it begins with will always linger in the back of your mind, even when you get to the whimsical Disney levels. So you know it's inevitable you're gonna have to dive back in again at the end. The final level is dark and abstract, and you spend your time there descending further and further into the unknown. It reframes the game in between the opening and the endgame content as this kind of borrowed time, where we're indulging in the fun and escapism afforded to us by the Disney stages before heading into the real adult stuff. But the journey is worth it because we get to bring some of that light down here with us. The villain of Kingdom Hearts is Ansem. You see fairly little of him throughout the game, but we get to read up on his backstory via various secret reports he wrote. They paint the picture of a curious and adventurous man longing to be a protector of his world, and maybe one day find a way to explore others. But in the pursuit of these goals, he ends up turning to dark powers that slowly corrupt him. By the time we catch up with him in the game itself, he's making efforts to access Kingdom Hearts, supposedly the birthplace of all hearts. Since Ansem believes hearts are born from darkness and they're destined to be consumed by said darkness eventually, he theorizes Kingdom Hearts will be a place of immense dark power. If hearts are dark, he wants in on the Kingdom of Hearts. He's prepared to get there by any means necessary, using the hearts of others to fuel his big hell portal. What's interesting about this is that Riku is essentially on the same path in this game. He longs to leave his world at any cost, even if that means using darkness to do so. He wants to save his friend Kairi, who's in a comatose state due to losing her heart at the start of the game, but resorts again to dark powers and using others to protect what he cares about. He's on the path to becoming the next Ansem, and what separates our protagonist from both Riku and Ansem is that Sora's approach to protecting what he cares about and saving Kairi is to perform a completely selfless act. Near the end of the game, to give Kairi a heart back and bring her back to life, he sacrifices himself rather than using anyone or trying to accrue power to do so. A move that would probably be unthinkable for Ansem or Riku at the time. As a consequence, you become a Heartless for a short segment before Kairi manages to share her heart back with Sora. I think it would have been cool if the segment as a Heartless had lasted a little longer, so as to get a section of the game where we really have to wrestle with the consequences of that sacrifice. They could have added some more in-depth gameplay here to justify a longer segment. As it stands, you spend about a minute as a Heartless, perhaps undermining a little bit how big the sacrifice Sora just did was. With that all in mind though, going forward, Kingdom Hearts doesn't hold back on devastating consequences, so I guess it's not such a big deal. Ansem awaits us at the bottom of that last level, End of the World, an endless chaotic void composed of the dark energy of destroyed worlds. Bringing us full circle, he's in the remnants of Sora's islands from the start of the game. Ansem's dark powers now on steroids, with the dark energy of destroyed worlds fueling him. He's on the verge of reaching Kingdom Hearts. In a game with so many bosses, it's only appropriate for it to end in a 4-part boss fight, the last of which having its own sub-phases where you navigate a giant demonic flesh monstrosity. There's a good combination here of the different encounter types present in the game. A fight with a humanoid, a fight with a giant boss, a few fights against hordes of enemies for good measure, and for better or for worse, flying encounters too. There's even a nice little narrative playing out during this finale. You start the first phase with Donald and Goofy by your side, only to lose them for phases 2 and 3. Then you have to find them again during phase 4, so the final beatdown of Ansem can take place with Sora's friends by his side. Side note, if you're at level 100 in this final segment after recovering Donald and Goofy, I'm pretty sure you're invincible with the right moves equipped and team orders set. Goofy has an ability where he can give his magic to others, lending Donald a constant stream of magic with which to heal Sora. So you can just hang out here if you want, and on expert and everything. If you've ground out to level 100 though, it's not a big deal that the very final moments of this fight are a bit of a cakewalk. You've kind of earned that triumphant beatdown, I think, at that point. Plus, I think there is a gameplay reason why Donald and Goofy aren't around for a lot of this finale. For much of the climax, you are solely reliant on yourself. Regardless of your level, this last moment is pretty satisfying. To have the whole team wailing on Ansem after such a long fight where you're separated from your teammates. At the end, Ansem is reduced back down to his human form as Kingdom Hearts opens. His theory that all hearts are born of darkness is supposed to imply that his worldview is that all people are inherently evil at the core, something he tries to prove during the title with the corruption of Riku. Ansem probably believes that pulling that off would validate a lot of his ideology and life choices. If people have inherently dark hearts, and Kingdom Hearts is where all hearts are born, it follows that Kingdom Hearts would contain immense dark power. But of course, it turns out it was naive of Ansem to think that the birthplace of hearts would be just darkness.
Supreme darkness!
You're wrong. I know now, without a doubt. Kingdom Hearts is light!
But why?
Kingdom Hearts has pretty soppy, cheesy messaging like this, but I think it earns it. With the defeat of Ansem and the sealing of Kingdom Hearts, the destroyed worlds can return to their original state. But it means the end of the world stage we find ourselves in, the collection of destroyed worlds, will also disappear. So while people like Kairi get to go back to their worlds, Sora's fate is unknown. As end of the world falls around him, he starts slipping away into an abyss. Sora, though, is such an upbeat, positive guy till the very end, that even when being separated from his friend, potentially forever, he's still smiling and grinning at her in case that's the last she ever sees of him. As if that wasn't enough, when home, Kairi discovers a drawing her and Sora started when they were young children, which unbeknownst to her, Sora decided to finish at the start of the game. Kairi completes the drawing, with the last shot before we cut to credits being a quick look at the finished piece they made together. Even if they're not together at home, they're together in their hearts. Meet certain requirements when playing, and after the credits you'll get access to a bonus movie showing a quick shot of an older Kairi on the islands alone, implying that it's years later and Sora never came back. This is why I'm willing to get on board with Kingdom Hearts' sappy sentimentality stuff about the heart and friendship and light, and why I think it earns the right to be as cheesy in this way as it often is. While it's earnestly preaching the power of love, it's not naive enough to think that the magic of friendship alone will just save the day and we'll all go home for a barbecue after. Selfless, risky moves are framed as good and noble, but they come with real consequence. Sora isn't able to help all these characters get the happy endings we see them enjoying in the credits sequence without great cost to himself. Riku also has to wrestle with consequence due to his actions, maybe even much harsher ones than even Sora. He eventually sees the error of his ways and stays behind in Kingdom Hearts to help close it back up, preventing any darkness within from leaking out. While Kingdom Hearts may be a source of light, the door to access it still contains a huge amount of darkness, hinting perhaps at a more nuanced take on the supposed birthplace of hearts, an amalgamation of sorts, more than just one element or another. Riku's fate is also up in the air in the bonus movie, where he appears to be fighting blind in some dark monster-infested city. Sora is out there lost, but in good spirits that a new adventure is soon to come. The tragedy and cost of doing good in KH lends legitimacy to the earnestness. A sentimental, mushy story, but one with edge. A story about facing the uncertainty of growing older and harsh truths and the darkness of a grown-up world, but not letting ourselves get consumed by that negativity or taken advantage of in the pursuit of growth. While a Disney Final Fantasy crossover might sound a little ridiculous before playing Kingdom Hearts, telling this kind of story with these themes seems incredibly suited to the language of those two worlds combined. Kingdom Hearts is a great example of what can be achieved via the often corny medium of crossovers. Though I guess it can't escape being corny too, perhaps that's its strength in a way. It totally accepts that corniness and embraces it to tell its story. Here, both characters, worlds, and mediums cross over, and we get to see both sides of this crossover use their style and character to do things they couldn't do on their own. The game is also, of course, a polished gem of a title that stands alone as an amazing piece both in terms of narrative and action gameplay that works irrespective of the presence of pre-existing properties. But to me, most importantly, Kingdom Hearts is a testament to the dreamlike qualities a video game is capable of eliciting. A sort of indescribable feeling that can only be evoked by exploring the unknown and the abstract via the vessel that is a playable character. A consistent, dependable vessel which we use to interact with a world that contorts around us in inconsistent ways. In the case of Kingdom Hearts, that contorting happens both with amazing visuals and stellar sound design. Maybe some game with tidy explanations for everything, some grounded world built from scratch couldn't achieve this as well as Kingdom Hearts does. By throwing all these different worlds together with the connective tissue being deliberately vague and intangible, the universe of the game does take on a kind of magical quality, a surreal atmosphere that again, I don't think you could manufacture from scratch. I think what really gets to the heart of that indescribable feeling the game produces, what really elicits that dreamlike quality, isn't just the visuals and amazing bittersweet music. It's that in Kingdom Hearts you can go and visit a twisted, hellish underworld with dark machinery that spits out ominous prose about the nature of the heart and the darkness within it. And you can also visit Winnie the Pooh and friends. I think that's ultimately at the core of what makes this game special. A breadth of emotion that can span that far that in this title, the most wholesome brightest light can exist in the same space as twisted, unknowable darkness. In a lot of ways, that reflects life quite accurately. As a game too, you are the one who can make the choice to get on your ship and move from one end of that spectrum to the other, letting every rung of that tonal ladder thoroughly envelop you as you're allowed to take the time you need to stand wherever you stop and absorb it all. When you stand in the bright, happy levels of KH, you know that somewhere out there in this space, in this game world, there's dark and mysterious places of endless depth. But when you're in those dark places, you know that in the same game world and space out there is also a place of amazing warmth. I don't think many other games have been able to produce a feeling quite like it. The fact you get to land a sick counter on Sephiroth, well, that's just the cherry on top.